Listen in the dark and know that this is not for idle ears. This is a map to a place where isolation became a method of control. I speak to you like a mentor who guides a man into forbidden rooms. The property near Crater Lake in 1903 was born of timber and secrecy. Waldo Oats built the house with his own hands and raised Phoebe and Wilbert in a world narrowed to walls and woods. They were twins, pale and silent, who shared a glance that cut conversation short. Their intimacy turned inward until outsiders were unnecessary and then dangerous. They read their grandfather's books on lineage and heredity and translated theory into plan. Marriage between siblings was not romance but calculation and ritual. They found legal seams and stitched their union into the law of the land. Waldo resisted with scripture and common sense, but he could not unmake what the twins had forged. They sealed windows and bolted doors and turned rooms into spaces for observation. Think of this as a laboratory masquerading as a home. They called children specimens and recorded measurements with clinical pride. When the first infant arrived deformed, they cheered and noted each anomaly as proof of hypothesis. The second newborn came healthy and was dismissed as error, a wasted variable. Preparation escalated. They bought line rope excavation tools and supplies that did not belong in a household. A hunter named Homer Mixon smelled a wrongness and came to the edge of the property with the intent to peer inside. He saw smoke at odd hours and a medicinal scent that suggested disinfection and concealment. He heard cries below floorboards, and the twins smiled in a way that unstitched his trust. Homer vanished after that visit, and his rifle was found a mile from the house. Notice how danger silences a town and how rumor hardens into fear. Neighbors stopped passing near the road and merchants adjusted delivery routes. The twins moved with a coordinated calm as if practice had smoothed every reaction. They documented each child and each failure and refined their methods in private notebooks. Waldo became thinner and more haunted by sounds he could not trace. He tried to count days on a beam and left marks like prayers he could not finish. This is where the danger shifts from rumor to evidence and the law begins to step in. A sheriff named Schuyler Tucker came with deputies and a warrant, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. What they would find in that house would turn civilized stomachs. Schuyler Tucker moved through the house like a man walking into a sermon about human failure. He carried a warrant and a duty heavy as iron, and his deputies watched each room with wary care. The twins received them with a calm that belonged to people who had rehearsed innocence down to the bone. Upstairs bedrooms smelled of stale air and neglect, and the walls were scrawled with charts that belonged in an anatomy lecture. There were stacks of notebooks in identical hands and drawings that mapped traits across imagined generations. The children were reduced to numbers, not names, and variables, not people. In a small shuttered room, a girl of 9 with malformed limbs stared through a gap like an animal that remembered sunlight and learned distrust. She made sounds that cut deeper than accusation, and the deputies recoiled at noises that were neither language nor plea. Downstairs, the kitchen had been refitted into an observation place with jars, crude tools, and notes that catalogued growth and decline. The air carried the sour tang of neglect and the sharp scent of chemicals meant to erase evidence. They moved to the basement, where the house had been turned into a machine of containment. Doors were reinforced, windows boarded, and small rooms carved with vents and slats to let in the least light possible. In one chamber, a boy sat rocking, repeating the same motion until his hands were raw. In another, a girl cowered with rope marks visible on fragile wrists, and the smell of infection wrapped the place like a curtain. Tucker found a room whose floor told a story of recent use and whose walls had been scraped as if some mind tried to hold on to days by scratching them into wood. In the darkest corner, they found a small body in decay, and the sight moved men who had seen violence into silence. They found items that belonged to Homer Mixon and Dr. Benson, and notes that described how each man had been lured and removed like an experiment discarded. The twins had left a paper trail of methods, a cold ledger of purpose and plans to expand operations. Waldo Oats was found in an attic in a state that looked like surrender, and his fingers had made markings that read like a log of nights in fear. When the twins were taken, they did not panic or plead for mercy. They spoke of heredity and duty and of a future that would redeem their actions in the light of science. They trusted theories more than human faces. News ran through towns, and curiosity became ire, and people gathered at the courthouse and demanded answers. Listen and remember that this chapter is where law encounters a mind that turned love into method. Tucker stood as witness to a domestic anatomy and felt the moral scaffolding of a county begin to groan under exposure. The twins spoke with a calm that stripped the moment of melodrama and replaced it with clinical intent. They recited measurement schedules and rationing as if dictating a recipe to justify cruelty. The courtroom became a place where science faced care and words tried to pick a side. Prosecutors read journal pages to a crowd intent on understanding how ordinary life had been refitted into a chamber of study. The defense painted isolation as sculptor and argued that wilderness had hollowed the twins into brittle tools of belief. Experts argued about pathology and purpose, and jurors listened like men asked to name a new species of wrong. Outside the courthouse, whiskey warmed the mouths of listeners, and the story grew teeth in saloons and on porches. Some called the twins monsters, and some feared a balance where curiosity slips into atrocity. The verdict offered punishment, but it could not return what was stolen from the children or heal the silence the house had bought. Guilty became a stamp, and the state took custody while the public settled into a relief of retribution. Newspapers printed diagrams and quotations, and families began to check bloodlines with wary new attention. Waldo Oats lived his final years counting marks on beams and trying to stitch a life from fragments of memory. His nights were haunted by sounds he tried to name and by scratches on wood that had once been his record of days. The children taken into care showed recovery that was partial and uncertain, and clinicians described behaviors that resembled training. They reacted to claps, to footsteps, and to light as if conditioned to fear specific cues, and this revealed a deeper design. The land itself carried a scar as trees around the property seemed to grow twisted and slow, and animals avoided the area. The house fell into disrepair, and rumor made it heavier until fire ended the structure, and men whispered that memory burned with it. Some blamed lightning, others suggested arson, yet the enduring belief was that the place could not survive the weight of its own history. Decades later, the case entered lectures and ethics debates, where it was used as a warning about isolation, obsession, and the abuse of science. Scholars cited the notes, diagrams, and notebooks as evidence of a private program of study gone monstrously wrong. The papers were catalogued and stored behind institutional doors, while the public kept a reticent curiosity about what such secrecy allows. Questions lingered about oversight and about the gaps between law and the places where obsession incubates. What follows is an anatomy of obsession and the slow corrosion of empathy. The Oats case did not end with a verdict or with the ashes of a house. It continued to echo through institutions, families, and men tasked with guarding civilization. Listen now as I map the ways a mind rationalizes atrocity and makes method from love. Isolation acts like pressure on a piece of iron until it becomes something new and dangerous. Phoebe and Wilbert had been forged in a small world and then trained to see people as data. Their notebooks read like field notes from a clinical mission where curiosity had displaced conscience. When a community fails to intervene early, the gap becomes an incubator. People whisper about warning signs that were missed, about neighbors who looked away, and about a town that chose comfort over confrontation. Responsibility can be diluted by distance, by fear, and by an instinct to preserve normalcy. In towns like Crater Lake, a stranger who vanishes can be explained away as a hunting accident or a drunken fall. The normal becomes a cover that allows abnormal acts to persist unchecked. Consider how the twins used every weakness in law and custom to their advantage. They learned to hide in plain sight, to use cash to avoid paper trails, and to perform ceremonies that blurred legal boundaries. They engineered consent from a community that had no appetite for scrutiny. Those who chose to investigate paid with their lives or their absence, and that price silenced others. This is the pattern that repeats when elites or isolated actors decide to conduct experiments beyond eyes and rules. They create rituals, they document results, and they rationalize acts with a vocabulary that sounds scientific. Language bends to justify what hands have done, and notebooks become alibis. After the trial, scholars and ethicists used the case as a parable. They argued about the limits of autonomy, about the duty of oversight, and about the danger of turning human beings into objects of study. Hospitals and research institutions rewrote protocols and emphasized consent and monitoring, yet the lessons would not erase the memory of the Oats house. Memory is a living thing that corrodes or hardens depending on what we do with it. Some communities hide from painful lessons, and others build walls of law and culture that force accountability. The Oats case forced a reckoning about isolation and authority and the fragile line between experiment and abuse. If you study this story as a warning, you will see where vigilance must be placed and how silence feeds monsters. Remember this story and teach others to notice the quiet things that signal danger and act. You are about to enter the part of the story where disappearance becomes currency and where human presence seems to evaporate as if swallowed by the land itself. The valley around Crater Lake carries a strange acoustic quality where sound thins and distances distort, and those who travel alone report feeling watched even when nothing moves. Into this landscape stepped the drifters, the hunters, the surveyors, and the seasonal workers who passed by the Oats home unaware that their routines were being charted in those identical notebooks. Every arrival was logged with precision, and every departure was timed as if the world outside existed only to furnish the twins with variables. Witnesses recalled a series of travelers who entered town and then never boarded the returning coaches. Their names survived only because merchants remembered their accents or the colors of their coats, and because innkeepers noticed that certain beds were never slept in twice. Authorities blamed snowstorms or wild animals or the roughness of frontier routes. Yet no torn clothing, no scattered supplies, and no skeletal remains were ever recovered. Absence without evidence became the signature of an unseen hand operating with calm deliberation. The twins had developed a system of lures that sounded harmless to those who heard them. A request for help moving crates. An offer of food on a cold night. A polite inquiry about the price of pelts. Every gesture framed with courtesy and calculated to disarm. The victims stepped into the house believing they were accepting hospitality and not crossing the threshold of a controlled environment. What followed inside those walls was not frenzied violence but structured procedure. The arrangement of chairs. The positioning of lanterns. The careful isolation of variables. The twins believed they were constructing a map of the human soul by observing fear, obedience, resistance, and surrender. They believed they were documenting humanity rather than erasing it. The land concealed their acts by swallowing sound and offering no witnesses. Travelers on distant trails might hear a faint echo or glimpse a lantern flicker in the trees, yet nothing ever resolved into clarity. When families wrote to inquire about missing sons or husbands, the letters were filed away by clerks who considered disappearance an unfortunate but common fact of frontier life. A pattern only becomes visible when someone steps back far enough and holds every vanished life in a single frame. That frame did not exist until years later, when the valley emptied and the trial forced the nation to look at the ledger of the lost. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the silence that followed each abduction, a silence thick enough to feel like breathing sand. In that silence hides the truth that absence can be engineered with the same precision as machinery, and that a calm voice can be the last thing a traveler ever hears. There comes a point in every forbidden history where the ground itself feels charged, as though the earth remembers what men try to bury, and in the case of the Oats twins, that charge lived beneath the floorboards where countless nights were spent refining a philosophy no one was ever meant to witness. They called it their living scripture, a doctrine shaped by whispers exchanged long after the lamps burned low, a doctrine claiming that blood ties were the only pure ties, and that the world beyond their shared lineage was a contamination waiting to weaken them. In their minds, the union between them was not a scandal but an elevation, a return to an imagined origin where power flowed unbroken from one mirror image to the next. They believed the outside world fragmented men into weak versions of themselves by forcing them into roles crafted by institutions demanding obedience and submission, and they believed that by rejecting that world they could carve out a dynasty uncorrupted by compromise. Their journals describe rituals performed at the edge of Crater Lake where moonlight twisted across the water and shadows deepened until the surface looked like a mouth opening into some greater depth. There at those darkened shores they made vows spoken with a calm certainty that would chill any listener, each promise crafted not for romance but for dominion over future generations. They envisioned children who would inherit not a name but a mandate to stand apart from the nation and rise above it. They wrote that the world rewards conformity and punishes sovereignty, and they intended to raise heirs who would bow to no one. Inside the house they rearranged rooms into symbolic chambers, each one dedicated to an aspect of their evolving doctrine. One chamber focused on discipline, where stillness was held as a sacred skill. Another chamber emphasized endurance, where long hours of silence tested the boundaries of patience. A third chamber explored what they called the fracture of identity by forcing initiates, whether volunteer or captive, to confront their reflection under dim light until their sense of self blurred. Their philosophy had no elders, no priests, no ancestors guiding them, only the echo of their own convictions bouncing endlessly between two identical minds. That echo became stronger than the voice of any neighbor or preacher or lawman. To outsiders their behaviors appeared eccentric, even unsettling, yet no one understood that they were constructing a generational blueprint designed to propagate their unity through future bloodlines. Whenever travelers passed by the house, they reported feeling a heaviness, as if the structure itself was leaning toward them, listening, measuring. Some said they heard murmurs drifting from the basement, though they never saw a lantern lit below. The twins insisted that enlightenment required withdrawal from society until nothing remained except the raw will to shape one's lineage without interference. In that belief, their dynasty was conceived not in passion but in calculation. There is a moment in the descent where the story stops feeling like distant history and begins pressing against your own mind, as if testing the strength of the walls you built around your identity, and this section carries that pressure because it reveals how the twins shifted from philosophy to practice, turning their doctrine into a living experiment enacted upon the people who crossed their path. The first documented captive was a trapper passing through in the winter of 1903, described as a man with sharp instincts and an independent streak. The twins believed those traits made him a perfect subject for what they called the calibration of will, a process designed to strip away the illusions society plants in every man. They introduced themselves with courtesy, offering food and warmth, and once inside the door the trapper was invited to participate in a simple test, a demonstration they said of a frontier trick involving ropes and balance. He agreed, believing it to be harmless. The ropes tightened, the chair tilted, and the room began to rotate, not physically but psychologically, as lanterns were rearranged to distort his sense of direction. The twins spoke softly, circling him like mirrored shadows. Each question they asked was designed to destabilize his certainty about time, memory, and tension. They wanted to observe the moment a strong man becomes unsure of his own thoughts, that precise instant when self-trust begins to erode, because they believed that was the gateway to reshaping identity. Their goal was not chaos but order, an order crafted by them and for them, an order in which fear became a tool of instruction rather than cruelty. The trapper resisted at first, straining against the ropes, calling out threats, demanding release, yet the more he fought the calmer the twins became, studying every tremor of muscle, every flicker in his eyes, as though reading a sacred text. Hours passed without markers because they removed every object that could signal duration. The only rhythm was the alternating cadence of twin voices asking him to state his name, his purpose, his origins, until the words began to lose weight. When his voice cracked, they recorded the exact tone. When his gaze faltered, they noted the precise second. When he asked why this was happening, they answered with perfect unison, saying that the world breaks men only because men do not understand how to break themselves first. They kept him alive for days, feeding him gently, offering water with steady hands, making every gesture confusingly compassionate, so his mind could not decide whether he was enduring cruelty or witnessing a twisted form of mentorship. By the end his resistance had evaporated, replaced by a hollow obedience the twins recorded as the first successful dissolution of independent will. His fate afterward was never documented, only the silence left in his place. Power always escalates once its owners realize no one is watching, and in the isolation of the Oregon frontier the twins discovered how effortless it was to expand their methods from individual subjects to entire environments, turning their home, their land, and eventually their lineage into a controlled system where every breath, every gesture, every silence served their doctrine. They redesigned the basement into a chamber of thresholds, a place where a man's inner boundaries could be bent until they no longer resembled the person who entered the door. The walls were coated in blackened timber that absorbed lantern light until no reflection remained, removing even the comfort of seeing oneself. This chamber became the heart of their developing dynasty, their forge of identity and erasure, and the twins believed that only by unmaking a man could they understand the architecture of the human will. Their next subject was a male courier reported missing in spring, a man known for punctuality, consistency, and route discipline. The twins were fascinated by him because routine makes a mind predictable, and predictability is the easiest pattern to break. He was lured into the house under the pretense of needing help releasing a trapped animal, yet once he crossed the threshold he stepped into a world engineered to dismantle his sense of reliability. They removed his satchel and placed it where he could see it yet never reach it, a symbol of the obligations he had lived by. They positioned lanterns so every corner glowed with uneven shadows, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. They asked him about the people who depended on his deliveries not to comfort him but to remind him how quickly duty unravels once continuity is severed. Over several nights the twins implemented what they called sequential fracturing, small psychological incisions that widened each time he attempted to reassert control. If he tried to demand release, they answered him with soft, unwavering questions that made his anger feel misplaced. If he attempted to reason, they mirrored his logic back to him with slight distortions until he could not recall his own arguments. If he sat silently, they praised his discipline, then stripped it away by changing the environment without warning, shifting chairs, opening doors, extinguishing lanterns, and forcing his mind to realign again and again. The goal was to destroy linear thinking, to make him experience time not as a forward march but as an unpredictable loop controlled entirely by their hands. By the third night he no longer responded with clarity. His voice drifted between muttering and pleading, his sense of professional identity dissolving like wet ink. The twins noted with satisfaction that he exhibited what they termed the softened interval, the phase in which a man's mind becomes pliable enough to reshape yet still conscious enough to understand the transformation. They believed this state revealed the blueprint of human obedience, and they recorded every detail as if crafting a manifesto for future heirs. His final hours were never written down, but the empty roads and unsent letters spoke loudly enough about his disappearance. There is a point in every forbidden chronicle where the actions of its architects no longer feel like isolated acts of cruelty but like rehearsals for something larger, something generational, something designed to outlive them. And in the quiet wilderness of Oregon the twins finally began shaping the foundation of the dynasty they believed would stand beyond the reach of any law, any church, any nation. Their doctrine demanded not only the breaking of outsiders but the shaping of insiders, and that meant preparing a future lineage that would be born into their philosophy rather than converted into it through force. They believed a child raised without the fractures imposed by society would become a being of pure will, a creature untouched by shame or doubt or external expectations, and they wrote that such a child would become the first heir of a new sovereign bloodline. The preparation for this future began with the construction of what they called the inheritance hall, a narrow room lined with carvings etched into the wooden walls, each carving representing an aspect of the human psyche they intended to strengthen or erase in their future offspring. One carving represented hunger, not for food but for dominance. Another carving represented silence, the kind that forces a mind to turn inward. A third carving represented reflection, not as self-awareness but as a test of whether the viewer could endure the pressure of their own gaze. They spent months shaping this hall, shaping it with the same fervor religious men carve altars, and they believed that the energy placed into the structure would imprint itself onto anyone born or raised within it. During this time they captured a third subject, a wandering musician whose life was defined by movement, expression, and emotional release. The twins saw him as the opposite of what they intended to create, and thus as the perfect template to dissect. He entered the house willingly, drawn by the promise of shelter and a warm meal, and within hours the twins began orchestrating what they termed the unraveling of noise. They took his instrument and placed it on a shelf where the moonlight touched it, but his hands never could. They questioned him not about facts but about feelings, asking him to describe fear, joy, longing, and rage, then dismantling each answer by exposing its contradictions. They forced him to confront his own lyrics, repeating them back with altered inflections until he felt as though someone else had written them. They made him sit in the inheritance hall for long stretches of time, letting the carved symbols press into his senses until emotion felt like a burden rather than a release. The goal was simple: to convert a man of expression into a man of stillness, and in that conversion they believed they could understand how to engineer temperament itself. When the musician finally broke, his voice faded into a low whisper, and the twins noted that even his breathing became cautious, as if he feared disturbing the air around him. This transformation convinced them that human nature could be shaped like heated metal, struck and cooled until hardened into a chosen form. And with that belief their dynasty moved from theory into destiny. There is a moment in every descent where the story stops being about what they did and becomes a revelation about what they intended, and this is that moment because the twins were no longer content with experiments carried out in secrecy. They had begun to envision an entire bloodline engineered with intention, shaped by doctrine, raised inside a worldview crafted not by society but by their own mirrored minds. They believed the world weakened men by drowning them in noise, demands, obligations, illusions, and they sought to craft an heir who would rise above all of it, someone born into a sanctuary of control, discipline, silence, and sovereign will, a child who would inherit not land or wealth but authority, carved from the twins' unified conviction. To prepare for this future, they constructed the Genesis chamber, a room deeper in the house than any other, a place with no windows, no view of the world beyond, and no possibility of distraction. The walls were covered in symbols etched by hand until each groove carried the energy of their intent. The floorboards creaked in a rhythm the twins claimed matched the beat of their shared pulse. Inside this chamber they planned the upbringing of the first heir, designing routines with the precision of ritual, every waking moment predetermined, every silence purposeful, every gesture loaded with significance. They wanted the child to grow inside an environment where the outside world never existed. But before they could shape a lineage, they needed one final study, and that subject arrived in the form of a scholar traveling west, a man obsessed with logic, structure, and scientific certainty. The twins admired him for his mind, yet saw in him the flaw they despised: reliance on rationality. He was invited into the house under the pretense of reviewing old maps and discussing the geology of the region, and once inside he was guided not to the study but to the Genesis chamber, where the twins slowly dismantled the foundation of his logic-based worldview. They removed all clocks so time lost its sequence. They altered the light so shadows broke their usual patterns. They asked him questions with no answers, questions designed to collapse cause and effect. Where does truth live when perception bends? What remains of knowledge when language fails? Who are you when memory fractures? Each inquiry was delivered with calm precision, and each pause between their words stretched longer than the last, until the scholar felt his own thoughts dissolve into the atmosphere. They presented paradoxes designed to trap his reasoning and contradictions crafted to erode his confidence, and every time he attempted to reassemble his thinking they shifted the environment again, forcing him into a mental freefall. The twins documented his decline, writing that a man who trusts only logic is the easiest to shatter, because once logic fails he has nothing left to anchor him. By the end his voice trembled, not from fear but from the dawning awareness that his mind no longer felt like his own. He whispered that he could not tell whether he was waking or dreaming, and the twins wrote that this was the perfect state, a mind stripped of certainty, ready to be imprinted. They believed his unraveling proof that their future child could be shaped with absolute precision, free of the weaknesses that plagued other men. And in that certainty their dynasty reached the threshold of becoming something far more dangerous than a secret. There comes a stage in this descent where the twins began preparing not only a space for an heir but a worldview that would consume anyone drawn into their orbit, and in this stage their focus shifted from dismantling individual minds to constructing a sanctuary of authority where obedience, breathing, and identity itself would bend toward their shared intention, shaping every silent moment that passed within the walls they guarded as though protecting a secret. To build this sanctuary they created a new chamber below the Genesis room, a place where no sound escaped and where lantern light seemed to thicken rather than illuminate, forming an environment that felt like the inside of a held breath. The twins believed that a child raised in such stillness would grow without the fractures forced upon ordinary men, and they recorded plans for cycles of waking reflection, training, and controlled exposure to truth. They cleaned the chamber by hand, not for hygiene but for symbolism, believing that every stroke of the cloth carried intention into the wood, every breath released inside the room became part of the future heir's inheritance, and every hour spent crafting the environment shaped the unseen currents that would guide the child's inner world. They treated the chamber not as a room but as a vessel forged for a lineage that had not yet drawn its first breath. They began placing objects within the chamber, each with purpose and none with comfort. A single wooden chair positioned in the center, a mirror angled so a reflection would appear fractured, a narrow strip of cloth tied from wall to wall to represent the thin line between will and surrender, and a carved emblem representing unity, a symbol they believed would anchor the heir's identity before external influence could ever take hold. Their doctrine demanded purity, and purity demanded precision. Yet even as they prepared this sanctuary they needed another experiment, a test not of breaking but of shaping, and that subject arrived unexpectedly in the form of a young runaway seeking temporary shelter. The twins saw in him a rare opportunity, a mind still forming, a spirit not yet hardened by the world, and they welcomed him with warmth that hid their deeper intention. The boy felt safe, yet he had stepped into the architecture of a dynasty. They guided him into the new chamber, introducing it as a place of rest and reflection, and he accepted without suspicion, sitting quietly as they adjusted the lanterns and closed the heavy door behind him. Within hours they began subtle experiments, altering light patterns, shifting shadows, adjusting the temperature, and guiding his breathing with calm, synchronized whispers. The boy felt himself drifting not into sleep but into a trance, as though the room itself were carrying his thoughts. They watched every reaction, noting how a young mind responded to controlled stillness and how quickly innocence became malleable under the weight of intention, and in those observations they found confirmation that a child raised entirely within their doctrine could become exactly what they envisioned, a being shaped not by the world but by them. There is a turning point in this forbidden chronicle where intention hardens into inevitability, and this is that point because the twins no longer viewed themselves as mere architects of a doctrine but as the progenitors of a bloodline destined to carry their unified will into a future untouched by the world beyond the timber walls of their isolated Oregon home. Every step they took now revolved around the creation of an heir, and the experiments they performed were no longer trials of dominance but rehearsals for the shaping of a newborn identity they intended to mold from the very first breath. The runaway boy became their final study before the dynasty would truly begin, yet unlike the previous subjects he was not chosen for strength or defiance but for fluidity, a mind still soft, a heart newly detached from the world and therefore closer to the blank slate they envisioned for their inherited line. The twins introduced him to rituals crafted for the unborn heir, rituals built around breath, cadence, posture, and silence. They guided him through slow movements designed to synchronize his body with the rhythm of the chamber, and they spoke to him in alternating whispers, creating the sensation that two voices came from one mind or that one mind echoed across two bodies. They taught him stillness in increments, beginning with a single minute of unmoving quiet, then 5, then 10, then entire stretches where the lantern flame felt like the only living presence in the room. The boy followed their guidance willingly, believing he had found mentors when in truth he had stepped into the template of a dynasty. They placed symbolic objects in his hands not for comfort but to measure his reactions, a carved emblem of unity, a rope representing control, a small stone meant to anchor his focus, and each object carried intention they recorded meticulously in their notebooks. As days passed, the boy began to change, not through fear or force but through the weight of repetition. His breathing slowed, his voice softened, his posture straightened, his eyes held a distant calm that unsettled even the twins, for it hinted at how easily a young mind could be shaped into the image they desired. The twins wrote that he demonstrated the pliability required of an heir, one whose spirit could be guided without resistance and whose purpose could be written onto him like ink onto fresh parchment. Yet they also wrote that he lacked one essential trait: he was not born of them and therefore could never carry the purity they believed was required for true dynasty. When the boy finally asked if he could stay with them permanently, they exchanged a long silent glance, one that held both admiration and finality, for his transformation proved their theory, yet his origins disqualified him from becoming the future they envisioned. They told him gently that his path lay elsewhere, then led him out into the forest under the pretense of giving him supplies and direction, and in that forest he vanished, leaving only rumors and echoes and a final note in the twins' ledger that the time for experiments had ended and the time for creation had begun. The forest surrounding the Oats property had long been a silent accomplice to the twins' obsessions, a living witness to decades of cruel experiments and whispered secrets. Its trees grew thick and entangled as if they had been shaped by the weight of unspeakable acts performed in the shadow of their branches. Animals avoided the area, the air seemed denser, and the wind carried sounds that unsettled even the most seasoned hunters. It was here that Phoebe and Wilbert perfected their understanding of isolation as a tool, and the forest became an extension of their home, a natural boundary separating their creations from the world beyond. Each morning the twins would walk through the misted groves, checking on hidden markers, trails carved into the earth, symbols only they understood. These paths allowed them to monitor the movements of the children without ever appearing to intrude. It was a methodical practice designed to reinforce their control while maintaining the illusion of freedom for the captives. They would observe from shadowed clearings, noting reactions to unseen stimuli, the way a single birdsong could induce panic or calm, or how the angle of sunlight affected behavior. Over time the twins developed an intricate mapping of the forest, not for pleasure but for dominance. Every knotted root, every hollowed trunk, and every hidden ravine served a purpose in their system of observation. Each natural feature became a stage for experiments, testing memory, spatial awareness, and fear response. They introduced small challenges such as food placement traps and auditory cues to measure problem solving and instinctive reactions. They recorded every movement, every hesitation in their journals with meticulous precision. Visitors who happened unknowingly into this area often felt an unnatural weight pressing upon them. Some reported hearing faint cries carried across the morning fog or glimpsing movement just beyond the periphery of vision. These accounts became local lore whispered around fires, yet the twins viewed them as useful data points, evidence of how fear and curiosity could be manipulated by environmental factors. By 1912 the forest itself had been transformed into a living laboratory, a silent guardian of secrets, a place where nature bent subtly under the influence of obsession and cruelty. Trees leaned unnaturally along certain pathways, wind carried sound in precise directions, and foliage was trimmed and reshaped to channel both the movements and the attention of anyone entering the domain. The twins noted these changes with satisfaction, recording the precise alterations and their intended psychological effects. It was in this forest that some of the first bodies of children and later witnesses were concealed, the underbrush and hidden hollows ensuring no trace would be easily discovered. They documented decomposition patterns, reactions of wildlife and soil changes as part of their research, believing each act a necessary sacrifice to secure the continuity of their work. Their perception of morality was fully subsumed by method in observation, the natural world complicit by mere existence. The Oats twins' obsession with hereditary study extended beyond the forest and into their daily routines. Every aspect of life within the house was meticulously regimented and subjected to scrutiny, as if the world beyond the walls did not exist. The children were awakened at precise times measured for optimum response, and observation meals were portioned according to age, health, and experimental variables, each morsel carefully logged in. Notebooks to track nutritional impact on development. Even playtime was structured to observe motor skills, emotional responses, and social interaction or lack thereof. Phoebe and Wilbert maintained a rigid schedule that left little room for spontaneity. Each day began with inspections, physical measurements, and behavioral evaluations. The twins moved through their household like clockwork, ensuring all variables were controlled. Their notes detailed everything from minor emotional expressions to gross motor reflexes, their handwriting identical, precise, and clinical, devoid of empathy. The twins spoke to each other in low whispers, using shorthand codes to record observations without alerting the children to their scrutiny. The walls of the house became canvases for obsessive calculation. Charts, diagrams, and family trees covered every room, each page designed to cross-reference traits across generations of offspring. Every room served a purpose: a nursery, a lab, an observation chamber, or storage for experimental equipment. Each device, every instrument was arranged with careful intention to facilitate their systematic study of heredity in behavioral development. The twins treated the house as both sanctuary and laboratory, a closed ecosystem governed by rules they alone could interpret. Visitors were rare and carefully selected. Often a tradesperson or messenger would enter only after careful vetting. Their reactions were recorded, notes added to binders detailing expressions of fear, confusion, or suspicion. These interactions provided additional data for the twins' growing understanding of human response to unfamiliarity and subtle threat. It was a perverse study in trust and betrayal, executed with calculated precision. Despite the twins' meticulous organization, cracks in their control began to appear. The children's extreme reactions and unpredictable outbursts challenged hypotheses and forced constant adjustments to routines. Confinement strategies were revised with each observation, sessions refined to improve compliance and record accuracy. These experiments were cruel and relentless, shaping the children's perception of reality and instilling learned helplessness as a method of control. By 1913 the twins had perfected a complex system of reinforcement and punishment designed to maximize observable results. Rewards were calculated to influence behavior, while punishments were precise in duration and intensity. The psychological effects were profound. Children became conditioned to specific cues, noises, touches, or visual stimuli with reflexive responses that the twins monitored daily. Their obsession reached a point where moral boundaries were irrelevant, only data mattered, and every human reaction became a measured outcome in their twisted understanding of heredity and development. The arrest of Phoebe and Wilbert Oats sent shockwaves through the small Crater Lake community. News traveled fast as whispers of the horrors discovered on the property reached neighboring towns. Curiosity mixed with disbelief as people tried to reconcile the outwardly normal appearance of the twins with the atrocities they had committed. Local newspapers described the scenes discovered by Sheriff Tucker in painstaking detail, recounting the locked children, the malnourished bodies, and the macabre notebooks filled with measurements and observations. Every article fueled public fascination and horror, creating a legend that would persist for decades. Trial preparations were meticulous, with prosecutors compiling evidence over weeks. Every note, diagram, and drawing from the Oats property became part of the legal record. Each item was presented as proof of deliberate planning and premeditation. The surviving children were key witnesses, not through testimony but through their conditions, which demonstrated the prolonged and systematic nature of abuse. Every medical report and psychological evaluation added weight to the prosecution's argument. emphasizing that the twins' actions were calculated experiments rather than impulsive acts of cruelty. The courtroom was tense as townspeople crowded in to witness the proceedings. Some sat in disbelief, others in quiet horror as experts described the methods used to confine and manipulate the children. Forensic accounts detailed the ways deprivation, isolation, and structured routines had been employed to observe developmental outcomes. The twins themselves remained composed, showing the same chilling calm that had characterized them during the search. They did not cry, plead, or beg. Instead, they argued their innocence from a perspective of scientific rationale that horrified jurors and observers alike. Defense attorneys attempted to argue mental incompetence, suggesting that the twins had been shaped by isolation and their own genetic predispositions. They brought in experts to discuss how consanguinity might have affected decision-making abilities and cognitive development. They tried to convince the jury that extreme isolation could produce distorted reasoning and that the twins had been victims of circumstance rather than perpetrators of premeditated cruelty. Despite these efforts, the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors methodically connected the dots, illustrating a decade-long pattern of abuse and experimentation. Every chart, note, and diagram was presented as evidence of intention, meticulous planning, and cruelty calculated over years. The jury saw beyond the twisted justifications of scientific inquiry and understood that the twins had reduced their own children to specimens subject to cruel observation and manipulation without regard for life or humanity. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on charges of murder, aggravated child abuse, and related crimes, it reflected the undeniable reality of the twins' systematic actions. The courtroom was silent for a moment before gasps and whispers filled the space. Phoebe and Wilbert were sentenced to life imprisonment. Their calm acceptance and unwavering belief in the justification of their actions left a lingering chill over the proceedings. Their story would become a cautionary tale highlighting the dangers of isolation, obsession, and unchecked experimentation within a family unit. Even after sentencing, the legend of the Oats twins persisted as tales of the property spread across the region. Residents spoke of eerie echoes in the mountains of Oregon, unexplained noises, and the lingering aura of the horrors once committed there. The story became an enduring reminder of human capacity for cruelty masked as science or rationality. The surviving children were removed to care facilities, but the scars of their upbringing would never fully heal. They were living testaments to a family's descent into obsessive and lethal curiosity. The aftermath of the trial left Crater Lake in a state of uneasy reflection. Residents struggled to comprehend how two people they had seen as ordinary members of the community could orchestrate such horrors. The surviving children became silent symbols of the tragedy, their conditions a permanent reminder of the consequences of obsessive experimentation on human lives. Experts brought in to evaluate the children described the severity of trauma and long-term effects on both mind and body. The 9-year-old girl could barely walk and displayed additional deformities caused by prolonged confinement. The 8-year-old boy showed severe cognitive delays. His ability to communicate was minimal and his repetitive behaviors were stark signs of psychological damage. The youngest children were in even more fragile states. The 7-year-old girl was emaciated, covered in infected wounds, and exhibited a pathological fear of sunlight. The 6-year-old boy had lost sight in one eye, suffered from severe trauma, and responded to the world with animalistic instincts. He did not react to his name, and his behavior revealed the deep imprint of years spent in isolation and abuse. Medical professionals described the children's conditions as among the worst they had encountered in decades of practice. They emphasized that the combination of physical neglect, psychological manipulation, and genetic experimentation had created irreversible damage. Each child required intensive care, but the prognosis for recovery was grim. The psychological assessments revealed patterns of learned helplessness, extreme fear responses, and the inability to trust adults or engage in normal social interactions. The children's attachment to one another was one of the few sources of stability they possessed, yet even this bond was shaped by fear and conditioning rather than natural familial affection. The trial itself became a regional spectacle, drawing visitors from across Oregon and neighboring states. People were fascinated and horrified in equal measure as the courtroom displayed the evidence of meticulous cruelty. The Oats twins' calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the devastated families and communities outside who struggled to understand how such acts could occur without detection. The defense's arguments about mental incompetence and isolation failed to sway the jury, who saw clear evidence of deliberate planning and systematic abuse. Phoebe and Wilbert continued to insist in prison that their actions were justified scientific work necessary to study human heredity and development. They refused to provide the locations of the bodies of Homer Mixon and Dr. Benson despite offers of sentence reductions. Their unwavering rationalization and lack of remorse shocked guards and fellow inmates alike. As the years passed, Phoebe died in 1934 at age 50. Maintaining her claim of righteousness, Wilbert survived until 1951, still believing in the scientific merit of their cruel experiments. The Oats property itself became a site of dread and legend. Locals avoided the ruins where the house had burned in 1920. Some said the fire was caused by lightning, others suspected arson. Regardless, the site remained haunted in memory, with reports of strange sounds, eerie moans and whispers carried by the wind. Hunters and wanderers spoke of unnatural tree formations, twisted and sickly, as if the land itself had absorbed the evil that transpired there. Animals avoided the area and even experienced outdoorsmen reported feelings of unease and dread when approaching the former property. The story of the Oats twins forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and isolation. It highlighted the dangers of unchecked obsession and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary horrors under the guise of science. The children's suffering served as a haunting reminder of the consequences when empathy is abandoned for curiosity and control. The legend of the Oats twins endures as a chilling testament to humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty. Years after the trial, the Oats twins' story continued to ripple through Crater Lake and the surrounding Oregon mountains. Residents still spoke in hushed tones of the horrors that had taken place in the remote property. Even after the house burned to the ground in 1920, the memory of what happened lingered with an almost tangible presence. Those who ventured near the site reported feelings of dread, unease, and the inexplicable sensation of being watched. Some claimed to hear muffled cries, scratching sounds, or whispers on the wind, as if the forest itself retained echoes of suffering. The twisted growth of trees in the area and the avoidance of wildlife only fueled local legends, suggesting that the land had been permanently scarred by the darkness that had unfolded there. The surviving children became subjects of ongoing care and study. Though not in the twins' laboratory style, they were placed in specialized institutions where doctors and caregivers tried to help them regain some measure of normalcy. The progress was slow and heartbreaking. The 9-year-old girl, despite intensive physical therapy, never learned to walk normally and remained reliant on institutional care. Her movements were awkward, her body still showing the lingering effects of prolonged confinement. The 8-year-old boy gained some ability to communicate but retained the mental capacity of a very young child. His repetitive behaviors persisted and he struggled to interact socially or understand basic cues. The youngest children faced even harsher realities. The 7-year-old girl succumbed to medical complications just 2 years after rescue, her fragile body unable to recover from years of neglect. The youngest boy survived until age 15 but never integrated into society. He developed severe phobias and died during a panic episode, illustrating the long-term consequences of extreme childhood trauma. Public fascination with the Oats twins never waned. Even after Phoebe and Wilbert died, the tale of their actions became a grim legend. Teachers, writers, and journalists referenced the case as a warning about isolation, obsession, and the dangers of rationalized cruelty. Community members often revisited the story on the anniversary of the twins' arrest, recounting the chilling details of the basement rooms, the confined children, and the notes that recorded every cruel observation. Those who lived through the period remembered how ordinary the twins appeared at first glance, highlighting the terrifying truth that evil can hide behind familiar faces. The Crater Lake forests themselves seemed to take on a haunting presence as decades passed. The area around the former Oats property remained avoided by locals and travelers alike. Its trees grew in twisted patterns and the wildlife kept their distance. The site was a chilling reminder that human acts of cruelty can imprint not just on minds and hearts but on the very land itself. Visitors reported sudden chills, strange noises, and the feeling of invisible eyes watching from the shadows. The legend of the Oats twins became a cautionary tale passed down through generations, emphasizing vigilance, awareness, and the recognition that the most profound horrors are often those we cannot immediately see. Even historians and psychologists studying the case emphasized its enduring significance. The twins had exploited isolation, secrecy, and obsessive control to create a private world of suffering. Their deliberate planning, the cold rationalization of their acts, and the systematic experimentation on children offered an extreme example of how scientific curiosity can be twisted into cruelty. The legacy of Phoebe and Wilbert Oats stands as a grim monument to the dangers of unchecked obsession, the fragility of human empathy, and the enduring consequences of abuse when inflicted on the most vulnerable. the Oregon mountains still hold whispers of the past, and the legend continues to warn that darkness is never far from places forgotten or hidden from sight. Today, the legend of the Oats twins serves as a chilling reminder of the extremes of human cruelty and the consequences of isolation and obsession. The forests around the former property are quieter than other parts of the Oregon mountains. A subtle unease hangs in the air, and even experienced hikers report moments of disorientation or dread as if the land itself remembers the horrors that occurred. There are no markers or memorials, just the twisted growth of trees and the occasional whisper of wind through branches that some swear carry distant cries. Those who live in the surrounding areas recount stories passed down from parents and grandparents, tales of children who were never seen again, strange sounds in the dead of night, and an aura of something fundamentally wrong lingering over the land. The Oats twins' actions were methodical and cold, calculated to observe, document, and manipulate the lives of the most vulnerable. The surviving children bore the weight of that cruelty for the rest of their lives, their minds and bodies forever altered by the unnatural conditions in which they had been raised. Their trauma became a subject of study for psychologists who sought to understand the long-term impact of confinement, neglect, and systematic abuse. The findings were sobering, demonstrating how early exposure to extreme isolation and abuse can irreversibly affect cognitive, emotional, and physical development. The story of Phoebe and Wilbert Oats also became a cautionary tale for society about the dangers of ignoring warning signs in isolated communities. Reports of strange sounds, disappearances, or unusual behavior are often dismissed as coincidence or the imagination, yet the Crater Lake case shows how such reports can mask something far more sinister. The twins exploited the lack of oversight, the remoteness of their property, and their community's trust to perpetrate their crimes without detection. For nearly a decade, even law enforcement officials admitted that they were stunned at the degree of premeditation and the scientific approach the twins had taken when committing their acts. Historians often point out that the Oats twins' obsession with heredity and human development was a perversion of contemporary scientific interest in eugenics. Their actions were not the result of sudden madness but years of deliberate study twisted into cruelty. The meticulous documentation, reinforced rooms, and behavioral experiments on their children reveal a mindset that valued data over life and observation over empathy. The case remains one of the most extreme examples of child abuse, intertwined with pseudoscientific rationalization. The Oats twins' deaths did not end the story. The legend persists as a warning to future generations that evil can grow in isolation, that human beings are capable of rationalizing the unthinkable, and that vigilance is necessary in even the most ordinary settings. The mountains themselves seem to guard the memory of what happened, hiding secrets yet revealing glimpses to those attentive enough to sense the lingering darkness. The tale of Phoebe and Wilbert Oats challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, the fragility of morality, and the enduring consequences of unchecked obsession. It reminds us that history's darkest chapters are often written in the quietest, most hidden corners of the world, and that the capacity for cruelty lies not in monsters imagined but in humans who convince themselves that their actions serve a higher purpose. The legend of the Oats twins endures not just as a story of horror but as a profound reflection on human nature, ethics, and the boundaries of empathy. Their actions remain a stark reminder that even in isolation the consequences of cruelty reverberate beyond the confines of a single property, reaching into communities across decades. The Oregon mountains keep their secrets, and the tale continues to haunt anyone willing to listen to the whispers carried by the wind.